Hey everyone, I hope all of you guys are doing good and staying safe. I'm with a lot of energy. I'm ready to get started creating networks. I hope you guys are also ready to get started creating networks and you guys are following along with me. I'll go a little bit slow in terms of creating the network, in terms of the labs, so that you guys can follow along with me. Watch these videos multiple times for the concepts of networks to sink into your mind. Okay, so let's get started. In the previous video, we took a look at a network diagram where we had public and private subnets and all of that. Let's get started creating that through something called as a VPC launch wizard. So the VPC launch wizard is an easy way for you to create a network architecture. And at the same time, the launch wizard supports 4 different templates. It supports a template which allows you to create only a network with one public subnet. It supports a template which allows you to create a network with one public subnet and one private subnet. It allows you to create a network with a private subnet with hardware VPN access and also a public private subnet with VPN. So it has 4 templates. Let's take a look at that. So I'm in my dashboard of my VPC right now in the Singapore region. If I click on launch VPC wizard, you can see that we have 4 different templates. We have a template of a VPC with a single public subnet, a VPC with public and private subnets where we have a NAT gateway sitting in the public subnet. And this is the template that we are going to use when it comes to our network diagram that we saw in the previous video. We also have public and private subnet with VPN and, and only private subnets with VPN. These are the 4 templates, but since we haven't studied about VPNs, we are not going to go to that right now. We're just going to stick to creating a VPC with a public and a private subnet based on the network diagram that we saw in the previous video. So before doing this, I would like to create an elastic IP for the NAT gateway. So let's take a look at doing that first and then using the launch wizard. So on the left side navigation bar of your VPC dashboard, you have elastic IPs over here. When you click on elastic IP, you don't have an elastic IP right now. You can go ahead and ask AWS to give you an elastic IP from its own pool of IP addresses. Or if you have any set of IP addresses that you can bring to the plate, you can also do that. But for right now, I'm just going to keep it simple and use the public IP address pool of Amazon to go ahead and give me an elastic IP. And over here, you can see that you can associate tags. And I'll tell you one more time why assigning tags with all of your resources is very important is because you can track cost. So if you have like 5 or 6 projects running in this particular region itself, you can allocate tags to each and every resource to identify for this project, it cost this much. For this project, it costs this much and so on. So we are going to click on allocate and you can see that we get an elastic IP over here. So the thing about elastic IP is that as long as your elastic IP is associated, you are not charged. But if your elastic IP is not associated, but just allocated, you are being charged. So always ensure that you clean up elastic IPs, which are not associated with any resource. So now since we have an elastic IP over here, let's go ahead and create the public private subnet VPC through the VPC wizard and use this elastic IP and associate it with the NAT gateway. So I'm going back to the VPC dashboard. I'm going to use the launch VPC wizard option. I'm going to go with public and private subnet and let's click on select. So now you can see over here by default, it has auto-populated the IPv4 address block for my VPC, which confirms to my previous diagram. I'm not going to go with any IPv6 notation. I'm just going to call my VPC as my VPC. But in your organization, always go with right proper naming conventions. So in regards to the public subnet, it has already populated it as 10.0.0.0/24. I'm going to map it to AP Southeast 1A availability zone. And the public subnet, the private subnet is 10.0.1.0/24, the same as our diagram. You can see over here, it immediately states that you have 251 because AWS reserves 5 IP address from each subnetwork. And the availability zone that I'm going to map the private subnet is AP South 1B. And I'm just going to call it as private and public subnet. And in regards to your NAT gateway, and we studied in detail for the previous video in the diagram, that the NAT gateway is something that resides in the public subnet and is responsible for doing network address translation for all of your resources in the private subnet to provide network or internet connectivity to those resources in the private subnet. So which means it needs an elastic IP, which is something that we created a few moments back. So let's go ahead and associate the Elastic IP with the NAT gateway. And then you can see over here, we have enabled something called as DNS host names to ensure that other than private IP and public IP, we also get public DNS and private DNS for all of the resources within our VPC. And we have also enabled DNS resolution by default, which resolves the DNS host name to its respective IP address. And in regards to tenancy, I mentioned before in the introduction video in terms of setting the expectation that we have default or shared tenancy and we have dedicated tenancy. Would you like to go with multi-tenant where you share your underlying hardware of all the resources that you launch into this network in that respective data center? Or would you like to go with single tenant where you don't share your underlying hardware of all of the resources that you launch into this network in that respective data center? That's called as tenancy. Now let's go ahead and create this VPC and walk through all the resources that this VPC creates. So it takes a few moments for this VPC to create because of the NAT gateway. It takes exactly 1.5 minutes to 2 minutes. So let's wait for that 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes, and then we will walk through the entire set of VPC resources that have been created. So I'll catch you in the next video.